The way I see it, what Macron achieved, in my opinion, is that he was able to internationalize the Lebanese crisis. Today, all newspapers around the world are talking about how the situation in Lebanon is an international issue, how French president addressed the crisis by saying, I cannot simply ignore Hezbollah because Hezbollah, if I decide not to talk with Hezbollah or the other leaders, I would just go back to France and the problem in Lebanon would persist. Having said that, although he just gave a new life, a few months perhaps, to this political class controlled by Hezbollah, he internationalized the crisis and at the same time brought Hezbollah's arms problem to the forefront of the discussion. He said, from now on, in the next few months, after the new government succeeds in launching reform programs, we have to sit down and talk about Hezbollah's weapons. Now, it might have looked like that the president gave a lot more leverage to Hezbollah at this point, but if you look at it closely, Hezbollah, the political party, the militant Iranian proxy in the region that portrays itself to be against imperialism and against foreign influence.
Yeah.
They were just sitting there in the same room with the French president sent by Washington and Paris to take orders from the West itself, which is the irony here.
Yeah, no, I see that point. Bachar, what are your thoughts about the Hezbollah angle on all this? Because
throughout the past 15 years, since the assassination of Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, it has threatened its adversaries, its competitors, and it has rewarded its allies with larger shares and more power within the system. This has resulted in more and more growth of Hezbollah's power within the Lebanese system up until the moment it fully controlled it following the 2016 presidential deal, which brought the main ally of Hezbollah into the presidency. And in 2018, it controlled the parliament after the parliamentary elections, which resulted in a government fully adherent to Hezbollah's power. This put Hezbollah at the forefront of Lebanese politics. And in face of people frustrated and angry on two things: the dire economic situation, which has been ongoing and downward sloping since 2015, in addition to the lack of services and the entrenchment of the sectarian mentality in the country, which people right now are starting to turn against. Yeah. This resulted in growing public sentiment, in a growing anti-Hezbollah public sentiment throughout the past few years. And the epitome of that was the moment of October 17, when people took to the streets denouncing the sectarian power-sharing arrangement in general. However, Hezbollah decided to put its thugs mainly in face of these protesters and to crack down on the revolutionary movement that was a precedent and a historic moment in Lebanese political history in general, because it transcended sectarian fault lines in general.
Going back to just, the role of Lebanese within taking control of their own country's issues, right? I wonder at what point in the near future you see that happening, because at this point in time, it just feels like we're sort of back to square one, aren't we? We're sure, if we're talking about the Iranians, the Americans, or even the French, at the end of the day, each of the above will have their own national interests. And as much as they may say that they have good intentions towards the country, they'll always, of course, prioritize their own country's national interests. So even with Macron involved, I imagine at the back of his mind, he has something which he wants to gain from this for his own country's national interests. When do the Lebanese get the power back in their hands to decide what they want to do for their country's future?
That's a very good question, Waqar. I think that's exactly why occupations do not last. That's exactly why oppression doesn't last. That's exactly why countries fight for independence. And that's exactly why the Lebanese should fight for their freedom and their independence. And they've been fighting for this for the past 15, 20 years. The Syrians withdrew in 2005. Remnants of the Syrian regime stayed in Lebanon, headed by certain political parties that were armed to the teeth. Now, how do Lebanese come out of this crisis? The Lebanese have to come out of this crisis by themselves. only the Lebanese. They can ensure to have a government that represents the people. Only the Lebanese can ensure there would be a government one day, a president one day, that would ensure the Lebanese national interests. France is not going to ensure Lebanese national interests.
Yeah.
France is going to ensure French interests, and America is going to ensure American interests. So the Lebanese, if they can stand on their feet and they can be patient and continue to fight, as we are seeing every day, brave women and men fighting on the streets against the violence.
Yeah.
At some point, they will achieve this if they remain united.